So good to see everyone. Thank you. I am on mute. I did the thing I'm not supposed to do. I was on mute. Thank you all. Thank you to Robin, Caroline, Stephanie, and James for having me. I wish we could all be in person, but this is probably safer, I think at least. I am not going to talk about the free exercise clause. I want to actually talk about the litigation itself from the perspective of civil rights litigation. And I say this from personal experience. I actually represent one of the parties that challenged Governor Cuomo's cluster initiative. I represent the Terrace Miriam Base Yaakov School in Queens, New York, and two parents from that school. And I'd like to discuss the nature of this litigation. For nearly 30 years, we've had Employment Division versus Smith. And we've had Church the Lukumi Babalu. And we've had these sorts of cases that have sketched out this doctrine. And none of it really prepared us for what happened in March of 2020. Our world was turned upside down overnight. Governors exercised emergency powers on a scale I think never seen before. Governors shut down virtually all assemblies they deemed non-essential. In some states, houses of worship were deemed essential. In other states, they weren't. In some states, abortions were deemed essential. In other states, Texas, they were not. In some states, gun sales were deemed essential. In other states, they were not. Governors exercise this broad power to decide what is and what is not essential, right? It wasn't about fundamental, non-fundamental rights. It wasn't about strict scrutiny. It was about essential. And this concept did not map neatly into any doctrine we've ever had before. In the early days, there were challenges to worship. There was a challenge to a drive-in service in Louisville, Kentucky. There were various challenges in Ohio. There were challenges in California. There were challenges across the country. And in most of these cases, we found that litigation does not really move fast enough to handle these sorts of issues. For example, there was speedy litigation to get a result before Easter Sunday. Seems like a lifetime ago. We've had other types of really speedy litigation. But then by the time we get to May, March, April, May, governors started exhibiting a strategy that I call whack-a-mole. Right? Remember the carnival game Whack-A-Mole where you have this little mallet and this little mole pops up. You have to hit that mole and you hit it. And then another mole pops up, hit that mole. And you're always just in this never-ending struggle to try to hit all the moles. And I think at some point governors recognize that they can take advantage of the timing of litigation to enact a never-ending series of short orders that can be modified when needed to moot litigation. And this brings to the forefront two important doctrines which should be familiar to all civil rights litigators: voluntary cessation and capable of repetition yet evading review. These are two doctrines which I think are very important. And I think governors went out of their way to moot litigation, and I can say this with a lot of clarity. In the Second Amendment context, the governor of New Jersey enacted 4 consecutive policies restricting firearm sales and firearm shooting at target ranges. At every point he was sued, he simply repealed the policy. And he was sued again and repealed the policy again. The New Jersey government did not follow a single responsive pleading in any of the cases. He just waited to be sued, then repealed the policy. Right? I don't care what you think about COVID or anything else. Governors should not be able to do this. Right? I think if you're a civil rights litigator, playing fast and loose by enacting a policy you don't wish to defend is unconscionable. And we saw this also in the religious freedom context. I'll use Robin's home state as an example. There was a litigation involving the Elim Romanian Pentecostal Church in Illinois. They won before the district court. They won before the circuit court. Judge Eastbrook wrote a very favorable opinion to the state. At that point, the House of Worship filed a Supreme Court appeal. Shortly before their response was due, the state magically decided we can repeal this policy and change it, mooting out the case. And the Supreme Court denied the application for an injunction, saying it's been repealed. Let's talk about New York for a moment. I mentioned I represent a Jewish school in Queens. We sued them on a Friday. By Monday, magically, the state determined that the zone where our school was no longer in problems. There were no problems, right? There were these urgent COVID expansions in our, not a zip code, but what's called our cluster. And 3 days later, our school was taken out of this cluster area. Wow. But there was a cluster area. Shortly before the case goes to the Supreme Court, what became Roman Catholic Diocese, magically, all those areas were removed from the cluster zones. And that's why Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion he did, that this is now a moot controversy. I think at some point we have to talk about the capable of repetition yet evading review standard. Governors have been playing this game of whack-a-mole now for nearly 11 months. It's a smart litigation strategy. It's a recognition that if you simply have a number of short policies, which can be modified on the fly, with really no rhyme or reason, the modifications are never really explained. Just, well, we've changed our standard, we've learned new science, we've done something different. At some point, I think when you're dealing with the free exercise of religion, this sort of arbitrary ad hoc changes does affect the analysis of how you view these sorts of modifications. Okay, so let's give the lay of the land right now. I think Robin did a superlative job, as she always does, of giving the history. I think Caroline did an excellent job with the doctrine. I want to give the lay of the land right now of where we are. On November 25th, right before Thanksgiving, we had the South Bay decision, right? The court 5-4 sort of changed direction. It's not exactly clear what the South Bay test was and now what the diocese test is. The opinion was, I think, a little fuzzy, and maybe Stephanie can get into that in a minute. But where are we right now? We have pending challenges in several lower courts. We have 2 cases in the Ninth Circuit. One of them is actually South Bay. Yes, the same South Bay is back challenging Governor Newsom's latest order. And you have Calvary Chapel. Harvest Rock, the other one. We have Harvest Rock, which is another church in California. And they've both challenged Governor Newsom's latest policy. What's this latest policy? A complete prohibition of indoor worship. Complete prohibition of indoor worship. You can worship outside in unlimited numbers, but you cannot worship inside. Right? The district courts in both cases denied injunctions, and that was shortly before Christmas. So now we're first week in January. The Ninth Circuit held oral arguments yesterday or the day before, and it's not looking too hot for the houses of worship. I think they may even remand and drag this case out even more. And this case may not get back to the Supreme Court until February, March. And I'm willing to bet anyone that Governor Newsom will, in his heart of hearts, find that when this case goes to the Supreme Court, his policy has served its purpose and we can move on. And that way the Supreme Court can avoid ruling on it. Now, with litigation for an injunction, you can't get an injunction usually if the policy has been repealed. The diocese case perhaps is an exception to that rule. But damages claims work. And in the case I'm working on, we actually have a live damages claim. We're asserting damages for the time our school was shut down. So we'll litigate this sooner or later. And I think it's actually a much better space to litigate an issue on a damages claim when everything sort of settles down than on seeking some sort of TRO or a preliminary injunction pending appeal. There's another case in Kentucky, and I think Caroline just filed an amicus brief in that case just yesterday or the day before, involving, I'm sorry, it wasn't Kentucky, it was Ohio. There was a Kentucky case and an Ohio case. This is a case from Toledo, if memory serves. And Toledo had a policy where they ordered the closing of all schools, both religious and non-religious. Those I remember, religious schools could open for certain purposes, such as prayer and worship, but they couldn't have their usual instructions. A panel of that court issued an opinion finding that violated the free exercise clause. Caroline's brief, which maybe you can talk about, argued that was inconsistent with Smith and Lukumi. I disagree, but we can maybe get to that in the Q&A. But that issue is live. And I want to flag the education cases because the court punted on this, right? The court, in another case called Danbury Danbury Christian School, punted on the free exercise issue involving schools. Why? An old chestnut called Yoder, Wisconsin v. Yoder, very old case. And the relationship between Yoder and Smith was never fully fleshed out, right? The Yoder claim survived the general applicability claim from Smith. I think there might be some reason to think that the Yoder claim may actually stand in a better footing in some bizarre regard. Okay. My last point, and before James yells at me, we'll be talking about Fulton, right? There is a case lurking in the background that none of us, well, maybe I do, but that the justices would rather not talk about. This term, Fulton, involves whether Smith should be overruled. Now, I don't think there are the votes for that. Maybe Robin, Caroline, and Stephanie can correct me. I don't think there are votes to overrule Smith. But I do think there might be votes to sort of tweak Smith. Tweak it just a little bit. And the space where you tweak Smith is in deciding what is a law of general applicability. Smith, for what it was, did a terrible job of answering that question. My goodness. And Lukumi did an even worse job. If you read Justice Kennedy, he says, well, we don't really need to define what general applicability means. We just really need to tell you, right? And it's maddening. I've read Smith and Lukumi so many times, I want to rip my hair out. It just doesn't give us much. And it doesn't answer the key question. What is the relevant comparator? How do you assess fit? This is Caroline and Robin's presentations a few moments ago. It doesn't tell us whether a church is like an acupuncture store, whatever the analogy is. It just doesn't tell us. We don't know. The way I describe it is, what is the denominator, right? What are you comparing the house of worship to? Smith doesn't tell us. Smith doesn't tell us how much deference you give to the state in defining the denominator, right? Now, I'll talk about the Sixth Circuit decision that Caroline filed a brief in for a moment. What the Sixth Circuit basically did was they used narrow tailoring to determine whether the law was generally applicable. They said, well, the policy is not narrowly tailored, therefore we apply strict scrutiny. And there's a circularity there that bothers me a little bit, right? Usually you determine what the scrutiny is, and then you apply narrow tailoring if it's strict scrutiny. But here, you're basically using strict scrutiny to decide strict scrutiny applies, and then it fails strict scrutiny, right? It's just like this incoherent whole. Now, I don't think that's necessarily consistent with Smith and Lukumi. I think Smith is almost incoherent. I'm going to stop here, cede the floor, and let Stephanie clean up everything I screwed up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. Stephanie?
There's nothing to clean up. That was great, Josh.